Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulent change. I've stopped listing them. This is Andy Revkin, and this is Sustain What, my frequent effort to use conversation to cut through the complexity and urgent signaling we're getting, particularly in times like these, when a lot of the norms that we relied on in the United States, particularly, have gone away. And there's this continual sense of uh, urgency around really critical questions. I normally focus on things like climate change and sustainability policy, but you can't really have a clear conversation about those things or have effectiveness if you're living in a state that's where the norms are degraded to this extent. So that's why I'm paying attention to things like the authoritarian, autocratic life signs. A year ago, I met the folks from the V-Dem Project, Variations of Democracy project in Europe, who basically study the life sign, the sort of the vital signs in countries that indicate if you're tipping toward democracy or toward authoritarian, autocratic um, government, and so much has changed since you were on this. Since I checked in, it was February of last year, and a lot of what was being described in your report that came out that year. Here's the what was one of the key findings that we discussed, which was there are paths back to democratization. There are examples through history. There seem to be um, a trend in countries in recent decades toward a capacity to reverse this kind of tendency. But here we are in 2026, and a core chunk of this new report on the state of democracy and autocracy around the world is the United States is in deep shit. Let's just put it that way. So here I've got Staffan Lindberg, and oh my gosh, I had your name right in front of me.
Marina
Uh,
Nord.
Marina Nord from the V-Dem Project, and I thought it would be great to just talk through a little bit about uh, that core finding that you have now about my country, the United States, and where you think what should people look at to sort of figure out paths out of this mess. So maybe we'll just start uh, with Stefan and just describe what you were thinking a year ago, and then give a sense of how much has changed, because the graphs you show just are unbelievable. It's like a real superstorm.
Mm. Well, thank you, Andy. Well, I'm on record before the 2024 election, actually even before the 2020 election, um, to say that if Trump comes back into power, U.S. democracy is unlikely to survive that. And a lot of people were talking about, oh, the institutions are so strong, and you have all this independent media and civil society, and the military is going to stand up, and you have this federal system with the states and so on. Um, and I kept saying, well, every statement of Donald Trump, especially during the campaign trail, should be looked upon as a declaration of intent. And I think this first year in office, with the second Trump administration, I think we're seeing the effects of that. And you put up the graph here. I chose with the black line, the liberal democracy, the level of liberal democracy in the United States since 1955 and onwards, and the red marks there, the first Trump administration, where there was a significant decline, and then with Biden in office, then it started to pick up again, but not all the way. And then this enormous, dramatic uh, autocratization, uh, bringing the level of democracy measured by this index back to a level we last saw in 1965, the year of the Voting Rights Act.
And
Excuse me.
and you describe how the indicators are very different. In other words,
Yeah.
the nature of the autocratic quality of the United States in the 50s and 60s is very different than now. Maybe Marina, can you get into what's so different about the indicators and why what's happening now is different than what happened before?
Yeah, it's very different. So it's the same level of liberal democracy index that we had in 1965, but you can get to this level in different ways because the index is an aggregate of different things that will go together into the liberal democracy index. So in 1965, it was mostly about voting acts. So the suffrage and the ability of having voting rights for everyone. So and of course segregation also that was a big topic of that moment. Right now what we see in 2025 is that elections are so far not affected, and here is a caveat because what we do, we assess elections quality only in years where elections are held. So the elections for 2025 are de facto elections that were held in 2024 under the Biden administration. But everything else is driving the index down. So elections are still very high, but what's driving it down is, first of all, legislative constraints. The worst affected aspect of democracy, and I think we talk about it a little bit later. So it has lost one third of its value in 2025 within 1 year, one third of its value compared to 2024, and has reached its lowest point in over 100 years. Then it's also civil rights and equality before the law, the second most affected component that is declining. It's fallen to late 1960s level. And again, it's very, very symbolic because this is the era of the civil rights movement. And the third most affected component is freedom of expression. That is now at its lowest level since the end of the Second World War. So it's a different situation. So it's what's driving the decline. This now is executive overreach, undermining of rule of law, far-reaching suppression and intimidation of media, suppression of dissenting voices, but not elections. And again, so far.
Yeah. The so far part is important because the Save Act, there's various moves by Trump's supporters in Congress to constrain the access to the ballot again. The courts so far have held a little bit firm. How important does that feel, or do you still see sort of that being vulnerable?
Well, I think we see a mixed picture. And so at the lower level, the district courts have sometimes ruled against Trump, and then typically one or two things happened. Either the Trump administration appeals the ruling and it goes to the appeals court, or the Trump administration seems to just like not appeal things they don't want tested in higher courts and then continue doing what they have been doing. And they have been, there are also multiple accounts of rulings now of contempt of court at that level.
Yeah.
And then as things move up in it and eventually some have reached the Supreme Court, and I think it's signifying that with the one ruling that went against Trump there on the tariffs, Trump immediately belittled the judges that were on the majority side as fools and lapdogs of foreign countries, and then quickly went to another legal provision to implement the same type of tariffs again. So effectively circumventing the court. I'm not, in the big scheme of things, I'm not very comforted by the court's abilities to put brakes on the autocratization that the Trump administration has gotten well underway with. Even if you go back and look at some of the rulings in the fall from the Supreme Court, they justified and legitimized Trump's what seemed to many observers unconstitutional actions in terms of encroaching on on Congress, fiscal power, and legislative power, and the Supreme Court said that was okay. So yeah, I'm still very worried about the court's abilities here to put brakes on this.
Let's get back to the U.S. in a little bit, but I'm going to zoom out to this report is global, and let's sort of take a break from the darkest part and go into the sort of semi-dark world of conditions globally, and they're pretty tough even at the global. Well, I'd say very disturbing. So let's walk through. These were slides that you helped to provide earlier, and we're just going to walk through a little bit the global picture. And maybe, Marina, you can put a little context in this. When was the last time in the last century or so when things were looking the way they are now, with 3/4 of the world is in that kind of population?
Just to explain what this map is showing, it shows the state of liberal democracy by the end of 2025. And this map would have looked very differently 30 years ago. So as you see, a large part of the territory is already covered in dark red, and dark red means more autocratic countries, dark blue, more democratic countries. So in a certain way, some countries already have, they cannot fall even further. So it depends how you see how you interpret what's happening in the world. What kind of, the United States is still doing a little bit better than other countries, but of course, again, if you compare it to the end of 2024, the United States was a dark blue, same color as Canada now.
Right.
This is by the state. So a lot of countries already are losing the democratic qualities, and we can look. I don't know if you can.
Yeah.
Because we show this global level, right? This is what's happening with the world. If you look by country averages, that means you give equal weight to every single country in the world. By this level, we are now back to 1995. This is 30 years ago. This is for a statistically average country in the world. We are now back 30 years ago. If you look at population-weighted averages, and this means in terms of for an average citizen in the world, we are now back to 1978. And 1978, this place here, right, it means that basically almost all gains of the Carnation Revolution of Portugal in 1974 are eradicated. It doesn't mean that every single country is back to 1978, but on average, for a global citizen in the world, we are now back to that level.
Right.
By territory-weighted averages, we are back to 1989, which is by the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And finally, the gloomiest picture, and this is something that has been happening since 2019 by GDP-weighted average. This is how much democracy is now losing in terms of economic power. By that measure, we are at its lowest point in over 50 years, and we are below this point since 2019. And you see a very, very sharp drop there from 2024 to 2025. That's because of the United States, because of course, countries that are more economically powerful, right, they decline more.
And just before you go forward, What created that brief burst of positivity between those 2 points? What was improving things? Where was that happening? Before the curve started to go back down.
So that's usually called the third wave of democratization, getting off with, as Marina mentioned, 1974, 25th of April, the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, and then that
Yeah.
spread to undo dictatorships across Southern Europe first, and then over into Latin America. A lot of military dictatorships, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and so on, falling. And also parts of Asia, Taiwan, Korea, and the Philippines in the 80s. And then you had the end of the Cold War in 89 and that enormous expansion of freedoms and rights that followed
Right.
throughout the former Soviet Union, but also Africa and remaining parts of Asia. So that's sort of the from 1974 to around somewhere 2000, and then things started to turn backwards again.
And there has been you see occasional sort of well, bestsellers by folks who seem to think we turned a corner. We were really heading up in an upward trajectory on everything. Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our the idea that the world has bumps and things, but it's generally heading in a better direction. And this seems to really cut against that. Like, is it just that we're missing bigger cycles, or were we lulled into a sense of confidence about trends?
Yeah, I think we were in the 1990s in particular. And we have a colleague in political science who then wrote a book called The End of History.
Right.
Liberal democracy has won across the world. Now there is no competition anymore, kind of thing. Um, and true, I mean, the regardless of which of these different metrics we have there, um, the level now is better than it was in 1900, right? Still in the world, like we have
Right.
more democracy in the world than in 1900. And we talked about third wave of democratization, so there have been two waves before and then regression in between, so it's like up and down, but in the big scheme of things, sort of up and down but gradually upwards. Now, based on that, we would hope that the current downward trend that's really pronounced would eventually fade out and then be turned around, and we would have a fourth wave of, right? But we're dealing with human beings and human societies and politicians across the world. There is no guarantee, right?
Right.
It's not like a natural law behind this. It's human beings behind this. So we we cannot just like sit back and cross our arms and wait for it to happen. No, that then it won't.
Yeah. What's your take? It's still too soon, I think, to know, but in countries like Nepal, where they've had these disruptive kind of youth driven movements to cut back against some of the norms, does that feel like it fits the pattern you were describing here and that paper? The idea that things can be reversed.
I know, Marina, if you want to come in here, or
Oh,
Yeah.
I would say I'm not an expert on Nepal, but I would say I would be very careful, like we're saying, that Nepal fits into this pattern, because we know for U-turns to happen, you need like two factors. One is quality, high quality institutions to function, and at some point start to constrain an autocratizing government. And on the other hand, there should be a societal action. So societal action alone is not enough, and institutions probably also not enough alone if there is no pressure from the society coming.
Right.
So It's a very tricky. Like we with this U-turn paper, for example, we know we did this qualitative assessment of how often it happens, and yes, it happens quite often. So roughly 70% of the last 30 years, like all cases of autocratization were eventually reversed. What we also see from the data for countries that are still ongoing through this U-turns is that those countries are still very fragile because once you had an autocratizing government, you usually have some legacy from those autocrats left within the institutions. And the longer they stayed in power, the more difficult it is to establish a stable democracy. So we saw it, for example, with South Korea that went like twice through these U-turns for the second time last year. We saw it happening also in Moldova, who had to go twice. We see it now happening in Zambia, which is very, very fragile. So it's something that needs to be researched. We still, as a research community, we still don't know well enough, like what contributes not only to reversing, but also to establish a stable democracy afterwards.
Yeah, and Hungary, will be in the news increasingly. They have an election coming up, and when we talked a year ago, you were indicating how Hungary is an example of the kind of hardening you get as the longer an autocratic system is in power, the harder it is to turn back.
Yeah.
Have you looked at Hungary much in terms of those prospects? It still feel kind of like a lost cause?
Yes and no. So, in many ways, electoral autocracy, I mean, they still hold elections, but the autocracy there has hardened. Orban and his clientels and the party Fidesz, their grip on media is very tight, and it's one of the worst autocratizers in terms of magnitude ever. Also over the judicial system and all the parts of the state apparatus, and civil society increasingly weak by foreign agent laws, by other forms of legislation, but also persecution for trumped up tax charges and such.
Yeah.
Now, the opposition has managed to coalesce a bit there around an opposition candidate. I'm sure I mispronounced the name, Peter Magyar, or however that is pronounced in Hungarian.
Yeah.
And the opinion polls have been showing that he has significant support and the regime is worried. And now it's filled with Russian interference or involvement, perhaps on the invitation of Orban, in the campaign and the social media and spread of disinformation, which has already been high under Orban. Orban has previously done changes to the electoral system that stack it against the opposition, makes it very hard to win. If possibly even if you win a majority of the votes in a parliamentary system, which is different, so it's not as proportional as before. And then, of course, it's the same question you guys will face in the US later this year. What happens if Orban and Fidesz lose, but don't accept the results and claim fraud and different things and nullify the elections and so on?
Right.
Along the lines of what Erdogan has been doing in local elections in Turkey and so on.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of concern here about both the lead up to the election, certain discussions about Trump, using a national emergency declaration that could impede a full and fair voting access and the like. Lots of what ifs. And just so let's get back into your report too. You had this idea of these trends underway. And maybe you could just talk briefly about some of this overall background as well.
Sure. So this is the last 50 years, The blue line shows democratizing countries, and you see that enormous expansion. And at the time in the 90s, there were over 70 countries moving ahead on democracy at the same time.
Yep.
Do you remember that time, Andy, that we were happy?
Yeah.
We were looking forward to the future.
Yeah. Yep.
And that just falls down to 18 now by our last count in 2025. Meanwhile, that number of autocratizing countries starts to go up there. At
Yeah.
least 25, maybe 30 years ago, Chavez and Putin to begin with, and then now increasing enormously over the past few years.
Yeah.
We live in a period, and this is also the context for what's happening in the US, right? We live in a period in the last few years where there has never been as many countries autocratizing at the same time as now. It's worse than the 1930s in that regard.
And the theory there, if there is one?
Well, it's also worse than the 1930s in the sense that if you count generously, that was 15 years, ending with World War II, and then the end of it, and 15 years. We are at least 25 years into this already.
Yeah.
Right? And just like the 1930s, across the world, these past 25 years, and this is not a political statement, this is based on solid research, not only from us, but from a host of other researchers. The last 25 years, almost exclusively around the world, this wave of autocratization is driven by parties that are far right, nationalist, and reactionary.
Yeah.
And anti-liberal. Right? So there are many things that remind about the 1930s, and much too much for comfort, I would say.
Yeah. And I just didn't know about driving factors, economic dislocation. There's so many things happening right now in the communication sphere, in terms of social media, which when I started blogging, when I was at the New York Times in 2007 through 2012, the information environment seemed like a fantastic global connection system, and then from, I'd say, 2012 forward, it became very different in terms of the ability for factions to amplify, to find each other, and then you have control of those systems by governments. I had someone on here a couple of years ago talking about the ability to turn off social media or turn it on, to tweak those knobs. How much do you think the information environment is at play in some of this? Marina, I don't know.
Yeah, I think there was even research on that. So it kind of course, it plays some role, but if you can look at it from another perspective, like social media exists, for example, in the United States, but also in Norway. But Norway, for some reason, is not affected in the same extent as the United States. So there should be something else, right? So kind of social media can be used to pick up on problems, societal problems that exist, but there should be some other context, some problem in the society that right-wing populist parties pick up. And it's something I think we as a research community still don't know well enough, because it's not you cannot pinpoint to one single factor that can explain all of it. Right. We know some explanation, and usually it's very context specific, because it will depend on the context of the specific country. Sometimes it's rising inequality and worse economic conditions, and then insecurity that how your children will live and whether they will be better off or worse off than you are doing now. Sometimes it's security concerns because the government cannot provide security guarantees. Sometimes it's unhappiness with how migration problems are dealt with. Sometimes it's about corruption. So something that's in the society which is very context specific, some problem. And then right-wing populist parties and leaders, they come in, they pick up on this problem, and they start to exacerbate with the narrative, playing it around, using disinformation, using, of course, social media, and driving this polarization in the society. This is something that we know. So we kind of can know in the descriptive way how it happens. But we know a lot less about what's exactly driving this decline. So,
Yeah. In the United States, let's circle back to the states. What I'm feeling just as a citizen here in the state of Maine, which was targeted by Trump along with Minnesota, not as extremely, um, you get this rebound effect where people are starting to build a sense of localism, local community connectedness as a way to counteract some of the more onerous immigration related activities for sure. I don't know, thinking about what Trump is doing and thinking about the reversal possibility, what should people be looking at that they can activate as individual citizens and going forward? What are the things someone can do facing these big trends? Does local action matter or not?
Local action matters, and we know that from research, not so much our own, but these scholars who study political mobilization at local levels and mass mobilization, protests, demonstrations, and so on. Our work on U-turns also show on the importance of mass mobilization, really. So first,
Oh, and actually, I remember you said that has to include the business sector too. It isn't just people in the streets. Maybe you could describe.
not only people on the streets, but in terms of people, what people can do, right, themselves. Uh, sorry,
It's okay.
excuse me. Mobilization, lots of people out in the streets for sustained periods, repeatedly, and not just like, I mean, the No King's Day is fine, but once every 3 months or 6 months doesn't help, right? It needs to be frequent and sustained to make a change. Um, so I think that's one area where people can really do something, organize locally or statewide, to protect freedoms and rights. The the second thing is I would look at, I mean, if we look at what's happening. So Marina talked about this a little bit before, but the dismantling of checks and balances in the United States is really the area where a lot of the action is, right? Where powers are taken away from Congress and put in the presidency, and the judiciary being ignored or undermined and um, made irrelevant in some respects. I mean, even the American Bar Association has been warning in several statements about that the Trump administration is knowingly undermining the division of powers. Now, what people can do, of course, is put pressure on their congressman or woman,
Right.
that they should not accept this, and then for the midterms, try to make sure as far as possible to elect people who are ready to defend the powers of Congress and defend democracy. Similarly, you have venues for voicing opinion and sort of putting public pressure on also the federal district courts, right? To sort of stand up for the principles of the Constitution and legality and so on, right? So I think the pressure from below can work in several different ways.
Well, let's hope that. I think some of that's happening, but it's hard, and Congress particularly seems completely paralyzed. Again, so much here circles back to the road to November and our midterms, if they do actually function. Um, well, I do encourage people to read your report and also to look back at that work that was done on the return to the U-turn possibilities. Is there anything else that you feel gets missed in all of this? In terms, a lot of this leads people to feel pretty paralyzed, and even calling your legislator has its limits. I have a friend who he writes a letter to Susan Collins here in Maine almost every week, and so I don't know. Maybe one more round at Marina, if you have a sense of what can matter, or if so that we don't meet again next year and have an even worse picture to look at.
Well, let me just say this: if we
Yeah,
can meet again, then at least there's some freedom left in the U.S.
that's true. I shouldn't be laughing, but it's true. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
we had an internal conversation before publishing the report, and I told Staffan, like, at least they still have the elections, like that to at least try to control and try to counter react to what's happening, because people in Hungary and people in Russia, they had to wait 4 to 6 years before they were given a chance to vote against the autocratizing incumbent.
right.
Mm, it's kind of, it may be a way also to legitimize what Trump is doing, right? So if the elections are won by the Republican Party, then it kind of just gives him even more power in this hands. So it may be this,
Right. Boy, oh
yeah,
boy.
double-edged sword in this sense.
Oh, and by the way, the other thing we haven't talked about is what's happened with the media here in the past year. I don't think that's something that people really anticipated. This sort of the using the FCC and just the power of the elite demi-trillionaires who are buying media and then changing the shape of the media. That's that was it is still a pretty profound thing that I think a lot of us hadn't anticipated.
Um, it's an enormous concentration of media power in just a few hands. Of course, this with Bezos taking over the Washington Post and putting restrictions was discussed a lot for a while, and right now it's this possibly overtaking then of that it will include CNN
Yeah,
and
CBS.
yeah, and CBS and 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 how open the Trump administration is about this. I mean, Trump himself has said for years, called the regular media the enemy of the people and unfair and fake, and they should be shut down. Um, he's even said in that context that it's probably illegal, or at least it seems like he thinks it should be illegal to be anti-Trump. That says something about the attitude to media freedom and freedom of speech in the first place. Hegseth just said he basically can't wait for the CNN to be overtaken and controlled and publish the right stuff. Right.
Right.
I mean, restrictions on reporting in Pentagon was ruled illegal, unconstitutional, just the other day.
Right.
But Trump administration has promised to appeal that.
Right.
The suppression and then the intimidation, the harassment of individual journalists, the threats from MAGA supporters, but also directly from Trump himself and from calling female journalists pigs and God knows what,
Right.
um, and being thrown out of coverage of the White House, the press corps there, um, the threats to revoking licenses, the suing of the New York Times, the suing of the Wall Street Journals, and so on. And it's clear that to me at least, that this administration is blatantly authoritarian in its approach to freedom of speech and freedom of the media.
Yeah. Boy, well, on that note, we have a lot of work to do.
You have a lot of work to do there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I greatly appreciate checking in with you. And Marina, any last thoughts from you on this
Well,
question?
I just think it's also worth mentioning that academia is also under attack. So
Oh gosh,
universities,
yeah.
that's a big thing that's happening, and it's not only the media. It's any free voice, anyone who is trying to resist with this free flow of information, and that what happened with many universities in the United States, and how quickly many of them gave up and bend over to the demands from the Trump administration. I think it's also quite indicative of how powerful and like how powerful this administration has become. So,
Yeah, it's true. And the same thing in the corporate world. It's not nearly at that point where you're seeing companies, law firms. There have been some that have sort of resisted for at least a little bit, but it's not looking good. Well, thank you so much for checking in with me again. I do hope we can do this after November. Let's see what happens. And I'm really glad you're all keeping track of this globally and helping those of us in countries that are experiencing the jolt of authority without any fetters. Navigate and figure out what to work on. This is Andy Revkin. This was a pop-up Sustain What show with the folks at the V-Dem Project, Variations in Democracy and Autocracy, who are tracking the vital signs of the conditions in society that can help us thrive as individuals and as a community. And keep up the work. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Okay. Hold on one second.